北進流の三流派が存在するが。
父様。
相手は誰？
Paul is a pretty terrible father. I know saying that's gonna trigger a lot of people. Let's be honest here, Paul isn't a very good father. Yet, his scene is so incredibly emotional. Arguably the most emotional and one of the greatest episodes of anime of all time. So I've been pondering this for a while. How can Paul be a bad father, generally speaking here, yet be such a popular, best father of the year, Father's Day and so on? Basically, it's a paradox. Because really good parents, we have a lot of, super fantastic parents right in anime, both moms and dads and so on. Yet, I don't really care about many of their scenes compared to Paul. And honestly, it's probably because they're too perfect. You know what I mean? Paul is like a realistic father. So let's talk about it, because I am gonna go into some deep details here on why Paul is arguably the best written father in anime of all time. If you like the video, guys, please subscribe, press the like button. Let's talk about Paul. So first of all, I have to establish, right, that Paul is not a very good father or husband. Of course, we first see this in great details, right, in episode 4, and season 1, of course, then, where obviously now we learn that Paul has cheated on mom, right, on Zenith. He's made a maid pregnant, and roughly the same time, right, they're gonna have daughters, as we know later. This obviously might break up his family union, right? And of course, now we as the viewer sitting here today, we know that this kind of turns out fine. Instead, he has like a, his dual wielding, right? He gets 2 wives instead, basically, right? But of course, even if people are gonna defend Paul and say that no, but like polygamy was okay in his time and it's like medieval time and so on, and to some extent, sure. But let's be honest here, Paul, first and foremost, is very much portrayed as he's a dog man. He smashes everyone. He gets slain, probably not. He's been with like everyone. It feels like Paul has done like every meal has been with Paul. That's kind of how it's presented, right? So already at that point, Paul is, selfish, right? He does what he wants. Doesn't really care about Rudy or his wife, then, right? And that's just a fact, okay? That's a fact. Doesn't mean he doesn't love Zenith. Now, Paul's biggest issue as a parent is the top dog syndrome, alpha dog or whatever, right? Paul can't handle not being the alpha dog. This is a very classic narcissistic trait of a father. He cannot handle that Rudy is like smarter than him, right? So he's like every chance he can to physically overcome Rudy or insult him or whatever, right? He's quite a rude, intimidating father, right? This, of course, has its maximum effect when they finally meet the course after turning point. At this moment, right, he powers all his luck, right? He's all sad on the course, but still, he immediately is like, oh, Rudy, you have it easy, so smart, you think you're better than me, right? And this is what I keep saying, it's a narcissistic trait. Paul has an issue that he cannot handle. I keep saying his son is better than him or something, right? And this is a very, very common issue. You find it all the time, right, with usually fathers then, that instead of trying to, lift up their sons, right, trying to teach their son a lesson and making them stronger and better and so on, right, they kind of rather want to push the son down instead, because they can't handle that their son is one day gonna be like stronger and faster than them or whatever, right? But because of course Rudy is Isekai, right, comes in immediately and is basically smarter than Paul and has more awareness and so on, right? As a baby, Paul is always like, well, my son has higher IQ than me, I have to shut him down, I'm stronger than him, right? This is always an issue for Paul, right? And this of course is a very bad parenting trait. People are going to defend Paul for this, he's out of luck or whatever, right? But like I keep saying, there's always been an issue with Paul, that he always keeps trying to challenge Rudy or different stuff, right? Especially then, of course, physical stuff, because he knows he can't beat him intellectually, right? And that's, the general reason why it's a bad parenting trait, of course, is because a better father would have tried to help your son, right? Would have said, oh, yeah, you're a smart son, let's do X thing or Y thing or whatever. But then Paul is like, oh, you think you're smarter than me? Let me show you, I'm stronger than you. You know what I mean? So no, this is like a very classic narcissistic trait, like a jealous trait. Jealousy, intimidation by his own son, right? Very classic. He sends his son away. Now, of course, we get slain from that, so I'm not complaining because we get muscles of the of the finest. But seriously, Paul and Zenith sent his son away, also not very good parenting. I guess you could argue that it is good parenting because it's like, well, I can't raise my son, so I better send him somewhere else instead, arguably. But it's a little weird. But I think the general issue I have with it is actually with both Paul and Zenith, which is, does he ever visit his son? And honestly, I think this actually is a little bit harsh on Rudy later on, because in the latest episode, right, Paul is angry at Rudy. He doesn't find Zenith his mom, right? You know, he's like, why don't you love your mom, kind of thing, right? But honestly, and I almost think a plot or whatever, but I think one of the worst things in the writing, if I had to be critical on the action potentially, is that neither of them ever visit their son, okay? So honestly, Zenith, kind of a weird mom too, you know? They send their son away, right? To not that far away city, right? They live in this village, send their son away, and then they just never talk to him. They never talk to their son. They never go to their older son again. Yeah, never. Obviously now they go teleport, whatever so on. But I mean, just in general speaking, no, they never visit their son. They never go to their family for some event or something. Neither of the parents does that. And then later on, Paul is like, "Well, don't you love your mom for?" It's like, you sent me away, Dad, and love them later. Neither him or seeing it. It's a little bit like, well, you did send him away really early, like immediately, basically. I'm a little bit like, well, I mean, you did kind of push your boy away years ago, and he never met his mom again ever after that. In Rudy's defense, honestly, yeah, a little bit. It's not that strange. Of course, a large part of it is the Rudy Isekai. Paul doesn't know that, I commented later. Of course, the peak of him being a bad father is when, of course, Rudy strikes him, right? Yes, of course, he's the one that loses the fight, but Paul does everything, as I mentioned earlier, to provoke Rudy, right? Everything, make fun of him and so on. And again, like, this is just like, I'm sorry, but Paul is a textbook bad father. Instead of being happy that his son is alive, he has to constantly be with him. Now she's in back, right? So instead of having like, oh yeah, you lied. Oh, you had easy with this guy and this thing, and oh yeah, easy, yeah. Constantly like that. Oh, selfish. Why don't you save your mom instead, right? And an issue, of course, is that Rudy is supposed to be quite young, right? Like, let the kid maybe not have all the pressure on him and so on, right? He's trying to push his pressure away from himself to his son, which also is later, right? So Paul is not a very good parent, right? I'm not saying it's the worst parent. I don't want to be very correct here, right? And I want to be very emphasizing here, right? This is just examples of Paul being a pretty terrible dad. But of course, some people when hear that, oh, Paul's a terrible father, they're thinking about, like, you know, Shou Tucker, right? Bondrewd, they have this kind of things. But I'm talking that Paul is like generally a bad father in, like, you know, I'll say it, realistic means, right? In a real world setting point, right? Where these characters are like, oh yeah, they ate the kids or whatever. I mean, like, that's just, those people are just horrible monsters. We can't compare them to Paul, right? No. Paul is not the worst father ever. He's not top 10 worst than anime, right? But, you know, he's not a very good father either. I just have to establish that, because, let's be honest here, it's a big part. He isn't a very good parent to Rudy. Now, to be fair, for Paul here, Rudy is a pretty shitty son, okay? And this is why I love Mushoku Tensei, right? Because it's an incredibly well-written storyline. And what I mean with that is that there are many layers, right, between Paul versus Rudy. But the general sense, of course, is that Rudy was isekai, so he never loved his dad, right, nor his mom, right? He had a hard time accepting them as his parents. In a way, they never can be his real parents, because they're like a secondary parents, right? And he had a terrible, of course, relationship with his first parents as well, right? So Rudy could never really love Paul and Zenith as like a normal kid, right? And obviously as a kid he had his own, you know, memories, so he could never really accept Paul. And this obviously is something that Paul picked up on, right? So again, I love the writing of Tensei because it's so clear that Paul always knew that Rudy never loved him, right? He always knew that my son is weird. He always kind of figured out that, well, he couldn't like guess that Rudy was an isekai main character, you know what I mean? But he was like, well, my son isn't like normal kids, so he's some weird in his brain, yeah. He always figured out that his son wasn't like a normal human, basically, right? And of course, he'd struggled with that, right? And that made him distant and probably detached from his son, right? So when he's sent his son away, he wasn't like, oh, dude, when I visit my son, but he hates me anyway, so I want to visit him, right? So that gets into the dynamic of, well, it's not entirely Paul's fault. It's also Rudy's fault in that sense, right? That being said, I won't really blame Rudy for it, because again, his isekai, we have to, you know, it isn't that classic like teenage angst or whatever. The main character is actually living his second life, right? So we can't say that he should just love his new parents, right? No, but they have the issue with he's struggling, loving his new parents, while of course his new parents are aware of that, right? And like I said, I think it kind of makes sense in a way that when Paul sent him away, he was just like, well, you know, why would I go into my son? He doesn't want to talk to me anyway. He hates me. So yeah, like typical. A lot of parents, right? They have their kids, and the kid hates them. I hate you, dad. So I was like, well, I want to talk to her anyway. I was just angry. Yeah, like that kind of feel to it, right? But honestly, probably the more pragmatic, cynical way between Rudy and Paul, because Rudy is very clearly distant, right? He himself from his past from the beginning. So I think there's a lot of layers on this thing. I keep saying it's a very well written storyline because again, it really makes sense that Paul would be to some extent a bad parent to Rudy because he always knew that Rudy didn't love him back, right? So he's like, well, why would I, you know, care about this kid because the kid doesn't want to teach me anyway. So it's really, there's some dark depthness to it. That kind of summarizes the dynamic between Rudy versus Paul, right? And the thing is that this is of course a realistic relationship, right? Where a parent doesn't necessarily love their kid because, no, sorry, but every parent doesn't necessarily love their kid, okay? And at the same time, the kid doesn't necessarily love the parent back. And we can kind of talk about the chicken or the egg there, what come first there. Arguably Rudy didn't love his parent first, right? Whatever. But they have this issue, right? They're fighting, the narcissism and so on. And at the end of the day, this is why Paul is so sad and emotional. Because Paul is actually probably one of, if not the most realistic father in anime. Because you're like, hey, you know what? He's kind of like my dad, yeah. He doesn't call me enough. He never visits me. He can congratulate me on something cool at school or job, whatever, right? He misses my soccer practice. You know what I mean? Paul is actually like the most realistic father, if yeah, top 10 real dad, right, in anime. That, of course, when he has an issue, when he's all sad about Paul, right? When Paul dies, you're like, you know what? That's kind of like my own dad dying. Yeah, like this actually feels real, right? Because you're like, all these other anime dads when they're dying, or moms or whatever, they tend to be perfect. They tend to be the super nice dad. He was always there, giving all this blah blah blah, and then he dies episode 1, and he's super sad, right? But we look at all the flashbacks, you know, and mostly shown in anime, right? Their parents that die in the flashback, which is of course weird parents who die in the flashbacks, they're almost always perfect, right? They're genki, they're fast, they're happy, they're super teaching, but you know, it's like, oh my god, I love my dad or mom or whatever. Then the mom gets killed or whatever. But Paul was like, no, I don't really like my father. Yeah, but he dies. So you're like, you know what? That's like a real parent dying, and that, of course, is the kicker, right? That's why the Paul scene is so much more emotional because you actually feel like a real parent died, not this like idealized version of what is like usually is the death of a parent in anime, where you can like, oh yeah, the perfect mom died. It can still be sad, of course, but I think that the Paul death is super sad, right? Super emotional compared to most other anime stuff. Again, because Paul is probably, if not the most realistic father in anime, basically a pretty shitty father, like most fathers are, right? Lastly, I think Paul's sacrificial scene is even more impactful than most other animes, right? Where the parent makes the ultimate sacrifice. But just because Paul is presented as a questionable father, right? A narcissist to some extent, never coming to his son, visit him, all this stuff, right? And that means that because Paul isn't that perfect dad, right? The perfect parent that we've seen in so many other animes, again, the shonen flashbacks, right? It's not actually that clear that Paul will necessarily die for his son. That he's willing to sacrifice himself, right, for the greater good. But that Paul has all his issues, yet is willing to die for his son, makes it so much more not only shocking, but it feels more dramatic, right? Because the character's actually going against his own beliefs, right? Because again, I would more say that Paul is very selfish as a character, right? So him doing the ultimate sacrifice is more meaningful than a character that is presented as a very nice, you know, parent, nice mom kind of character that isn't selfish. That she is sacrificing her life for saving her kids doesn't feel as impactful because, yeah, well, obviously this character was always not very selfish, right? This is a lot more, right? And like I said in the video, after I watched the episode, right, did my video, I called my own father. I was like, man, I told my dad, right, it's Father's Day and so on. And I was pondering about it. I didn't ask my dad, but I was pondering, would my father has died to save me? He's also a very selfish one. And I was like, I wonder would he have done it. But in the end, I feel, yeah, probably. If anything, because he's a proud person, right? He would do it out of the honor of his family kind of thing. But that's kind of what I mean, is that you have these parents that are you know, super nice and cuddly or whatever. But then when push comes to shove, they won't do shit, you know what I mean? They won't actually confront the bully. They don't. Yeah, they're running away, right? Paul is an interesting dad because not the best parent, but he's very willing to do the right thing when it matters, right? To be honest though, Paul is very similar to my own father, and that also might be why I felt very emotional over Paul's scene. After all, I had 37 stepmoms growing up, so I've seen this scene exactly happening. Yeah, like, man, it's very, very relatable. Yeah. And my father never visited me. I saw him like once 6 months, and we have a similar backstory of like a branch noble family and all the good stuff. And he even had the same hair as my. Is Paul my father? All jokes aside though, seriously, Paul is super similar to my father. Like, yeah, Jesus Christ, man. It's never been a parent character in anime that's been so similar to my father. Similar backstory, cheating on my mom and every other woman ever, done a lot of waifus, smashed everyone, has the same hair, same personality, extremely narcissistic. There we go, hope you liked the video. If you do, please subscribe, slap button, see my next video. Why Endeavour is the best father in anime. That's right, subscribe guys, the next video will be how Endeavour is of course the best father ever.